February 3rd, 1964. Manchester, New Hampshire. The burned body of 54-year-old Rena Paquette is discovered in a pigsty on her family's farm. Even though there are no containers for flammable substances at the scene, investigators believe that Rena set herself on fire and rule her death to be a suicide. However, many people suspect that Rena's death was connected to the recent murder of a local teenage girl named Pamela Mason, as Rena believes she knew the killer's identity and had shared it with the police. Over the next several decades, there would be a number of twists and turns, including the murder of one of Rena's sons, but her death officially remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I'm going to be chronicling a very unusual cold case, the 1964 death of Rena Paquette. As you well know, this podcast loves to explore cases from unsolved mysteries, but this is going to be a bit different from the norm. While Rena's death did get featured on the show, the prime focus of the segment was the 1985 murder of Rena's son, Danny Paquette. Danny's murder was eventually solved many years later, but after recently rewatching the segment, I started wondering, whatever happened with Rena's case? Well, it turns out the tragic saga of the Paquette family is a much deeper rabbit hole than I thought. Investigators initially ruled that Rena committed suicide by setting herself on fire, but her family believes she was killed by the same person responsible for the murder of a teenage girl named Pamela Mason, which took place in the area less than 1 month earlier. A suspect was eventually charged with Pamela's murder, but his conviction caused so much controversy that it wound up going all the way to the United States Supreme Court. As you can imagine, this is a very multi-layered story with a number of twists and turns, but throughout it all, Rena Paquette's death has never actually been solved, so we're going to delve into it on this episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is finally on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards from yours truly, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the bizarre death of Rena Paquette. Our story begins in 1964 in Manchester, New Hampshire. Our central figure is 54-year-old Rena Paquette, who lives on a dairy farm on the outskirts of town with her husband, Arthur. The couple have 6 children, the youngest being their 15-year-old son, Danny. On the morning of Monday, February 3rd, Danny was going to be off from school for a dental appointment, so his mother allowed him to sleep late and would wake him up when it was time to get ready. When Danny woke up, he was surprised to discover that it was past 10 a.m. and that he'd slept through his appointment. Danny went downstairs and discovered that the house was empty and Rena was nowhere in sight. Since it was a very cold winter morning, he became concerned once he noticed that his mother's winter coat had been left behind. Danny called up his uncle to let him know Rena was missing, and he soon came over to the farm to help Danny look for her. Since the family's property was so large, they searched for over an hour until they noticed smoke coming from an abandoned pigsty located about a half-mile away from the farmhouse. 2 logs had been placed in front of the pigsty's door, But after they were moved and the door was opened, Danny and his uncle were shocked to discover Rena's charred body on the ground inside. She had been set on fire and burned to death, and was clad only in slippers and a nightgown. The police were immediately notified, but after investigating the incident, New Hampshire Attorney General William Maynard made a surprising announcement to the press. Rena had taken her own life, and the official cause of death was cremation by suicide. Even though there were no flammable substances like gasoline found at the scene or any empty containers, the authorities believed that Rena intentionally set herself on fire. Maynard theorized that Rena did this because she had become despondent over the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which took place 2.5 months earlier. He also speculated that the recent murder of a local 14-year-old girl named Pamela Mason was the breaking point which pushed Rena over the edge. Well, needless to say, Rena's family did not buy this explanation at all. In fact, on the day they returned home from her funeral, they discovered that another fire had been started inside the pigsty, which they believed was an attempt to destroy potential evidence. It also seemed impossible for Rena to have placed the 2 logs in front of the pigsty door before sealing herself inside. And if that wasn't enough, Rena also had her own personal connection to Pamela Mason's murder. On January 13th, 3 weeks before Rena's death, Pamela had received a phone call at her home from an unidentified man who claimed he was interested in hiring her to babysit his 1-year-old child that night. He had gotten her number from a flyer Pamela posted on the bulletin board of a local laundromat to advertise her services as a babysitter. The caller spoke to Pamela's mother and provided a nearby address, and she thought the man sounded so pleasant that she agreed to allow Pamela to take the job. This man soon arrived outside Pamela's home to pick her up, but she never returned. Even though he had provided a name, phone number, and address, it turned out they belonged to an elderly couple who had no knowledge of the call to Pamela. In addition, no one else caught a glimpse of the man when he picked Pamela up. 8 days later, Pamela's body was discovered in a melting snowbank alongside Interstate Route 93. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed 4 times, had her throat slashed, and was shot twice in the head. It was believed that Pamela was killed at another location before her body was dumped in the snowbank. Investigators immediately noticed the striking similarities between the crime and the murder of another young woman which took place in Manchester 4 years earlier. On February 1st, 1960, 18-year-old Sandra Valade disappeared after leaving her swimming class at the YMCA. Much like Pamela, Sandra was discovered in a snowbank 9 days later, and she had also been sexually assaulted, stabbed 4 times, and shot 4 times. This location was only 2 miles away from the spot where Pamela was eventually found. In both cases, a snowstorm happened to take place on the night the girls went missing, and their personal belongings would be found scattered around town. This led to speculation that both victims may have been murdered by the same perpetrator. Well, here's where the connection to Rena Paquette comes into play. She just happened to work at the same laundromat where Pamela had posted the flyer for her babysitting services. Weeks after the murder, Rena surprised her family by revealing that she believed the killer was a local resident named Edward Coolidge. Coolidge was a 27-year-old bakery delivery man with a wife and 17-month-old daughter, and his mother was the owner of the laundromat where Rena worked. According to Rena, this woman had phoned her and expressed her concern that her son had seen Pamela's flyer at the laundromat and subsequently called the girl up and lured her to her death by offering a fake babysitting job. Rena suspected that Coolidge's mother did not have the strength to contact the police and turn in her own son, so she wanted Rena to do it for her. The reason she selected Rena for this task is because she believed her son had murdered Pamela inside the abandoned pigsty on the Paquette family property before dumping her body. Rena ultimately decided to contact the police, and when a pair of detectives visited her farm, she shared her information about Coolidge. Over the course of the next few days, the Paquette family received 2 threatening phone calls, and Coolidge would drop by the laundromat to have a heated conversation with Rena. On the morning of February 3rd, Rena told her husband she was going to have a talk with Coolidge's mother, but Arthur asked her to keep her nose out of things. Of course, shortly after Arthur left the house, Rena would turn up dead in the exact same pigsty where Coolidge allegedly murdered Pamela Mason. It would turn out that Coolidge was questioned at the police station on February 2nd and held overnight on an unrelated theft charge. While being given a lie detector test, Coolidge would confess to stealing over $300 from his employer and was released from custody the very same morning Rena turned up dead. However, it was just over 2 weeks later, on February 19th, that Coolidge was arrested and charged with the murder of Pamela Mason. Coolidge had provided an alibi for the night of the crime, claiming that he had been driving home on Route 93 and gotten stuck in the snow before some motorists pulled over to push his vehicle out. The story was technically true, but the motorists claimed they helped Coolidge at a much later time than he told police, and the location was in close proximity to the spot where Pamela's body was eventually found. 4 witnesses claimed that Coolidge had asked them to lie about his whereabouts on the night of the murder in order to fabricate an alibi, and Pamela's mother described Coolidge's voice as sounding very similar to the man she spoke to on the phone about her daughter's babysitting job. It was also established that Coolidge had been at the laundromat on the day Pamela was killed, where he easily could have seen her flyer. A microscopic analysis was performed on clothing obtained from Coolidge's residence, and it turned up samples of what appeared to be Pamela's hair. Vacuum sweepings taken from inside Coolidge's vehicle contained particles which appeared to match Pamela's clothing, and articles of gunpowder which matched a .22 caliber Mossberg rifle Coolidge owned and was believed to be the murder weapon. Ballistics tests also seemed to indicate that bullets from the same gun had been used to shoot Sandra Valade nearly 4 years earlier, so Coolidge was indicted for her murder as well. However, even though Rena Paquette's family strongly believed that Coolidge killed her too, the authorities refused to change their ruling that Rena's death was a suicide. Whenever Arthur Paquette pushed them to reopen the case, he was told to shut up or he would be arrested. Anyway, in May of 1965, Coolidge went on trial for Pamela Mason's murder, and surprisingly, it would be his defense team who first introduced the idea that the same Mossberg rifle had been used to kill both Pamela and Sandra Valade. This turned out to be an attempt at generating reasonable doubt, as Coolidge claimed that he did not even own this particular rifle until he won it in a contest in December of 1961, nearly 2 years after Sandra was killed. If this was true, then how could the ballistics evidence be so certain that the same gun was used to murder both Sandra and Pamela? But in spite of this, there was still a strong enough circumstantial case against Coolidge that the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The state ultimately decided to drop the charge for Sandra Valade's murder, as without conclusive ballistics evidence, there wasn't anything else to tie him to that crime, and it seemed like he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison anyway. But there would eventually be a major complication with Coolidge's conviction. You see, when the Manchester police originally obtained a warrant to search Coolidge's vehicle and residence in order to obtain the evidence against him, they got State Attorney General William Maynard to sign it. The problem is that Maynard wound up prosecuting the case when it went to trial. As a result, the conviction was appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1971, and Coolidge v. New Hampshire turned out to be a landmark case. In a 5-4 decision, they voted to overturn Coolidge's conviction based on the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires probable cause. It was ruled that the searches and seizures of Coolidge's property were unconstitutional and invalid because the warrant was signed by the same man who wound up prosecuting him, Attorney General Maynard. In the opinion of one of the justices, the warrant should have been issued by a quote-unquote neutral and detached magistrate. Coolidge was now entitled to a second trial, but he ultimately decided to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder, which carried a sentence of 25 to 40 years with the possibility of parole rather than life imprisonment. Anyway, this story would eventually swing back to the Paquette family, who would suffer a second mysterious death. Possibly due to the trauma of discovering his mother's burned body, Danny Paquette would go on to live a troubled life over the course of the next 2 decades. He got married and had 2 children, but the marriage eventually ended in a bitter divorce in which Danny lost custody of his kids. At one point, Danny had a meltdown and showed up at his ex-wife's house, where he attempted to force his way inside. After the police were notified, Danny was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at a state mental hospital. During one of his therapy sessions there, Danny went under hypnosis and claimed that he had a flashback to the morning of his mother's murder. In fact, he had a vision of her having a heated argument with a man in a white uniform. Since Edward Coolidge wore a white uniform for his job as a bakery delivery man, this reinforced Danny's belief that Coolidge was the killer, and he had repressed the memory of seeing him in his house right before his mother was abducted. In spite of this new revelation, the police would not reopen Rena's case, but Danny told people that he was planning to write Coolidge in prison and confront him at his next parole hearing. Coolidge had been granted conditional parole for good behavior and was scheduled to be released in 1984, but the governor of New Hampshire collected over 20,000 signatures in order to petition the state parole board to reconsider their decision. The state would respond by passing a truth in sentencing law, which required defendants to at least serve their minimum sentence before they could be paroled, which ensured that Coolidge would serve at least 25 years. On the morning of November 9, 1985, Danny himself would become a murder victim. While welding a bulldozer outside his home in the town of Hooksett, Danny was shot in the heart through his back and killed instantly at the age of 36. Even though two of Danny's friends were also present at the scene and recalled hearing a loud pop, neither of them actually saw the fatal shot, which had come from several yards away in a nearby field. Since Danny had been lobbying to get his mother's case reopened, many of his family members and friends wondered if his murder might be connected, though Edward Coolidge was still incarcerated at that time. Since the investigation into Danny's death failed to turn up any suspects, it was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in October of 1990. While the segment started off by examining Rena's death, her case was mostly used as a springboard to explore Danny's murder. They also made reference to Pamela Mason's murder, but they never actually referred to Edward Coolidge by name. In March of 1991, only a few months after the segment aired, Coolidge would finally be released from prison, though he continued to maintain his innocence in Pamela Mason's murder. The new exposure for the case finally compelled the authorities to exhume Rena Paquette's body. An employee in the medical examiner's office was able to find her original autopsy report, which contained some information which had never been made public before. The report revealed that semen was found on Rena's body, and there was evidence that her arms had been bound. It also made mention of the fact that Rena had been found lying flat on her back, even though victims who are set on fire are usually found in twisted, contorted positions due to the excruciating pain it causes. This seemed to indicate that Rena was already dead before her body was burned. A retired Manchester police officer who had investigated Rena's death was also interviewed around this time period and stated that none of the detectives actually believed she committed suicide, but a higher-up, whom he believed to be Attorney General William Maynard, had ordered them to forget their suspicions of murder. In spite of these new discoveries, there was not enough evidence to launch a new homicide investigation, though Rena's official cause of death was officially changed from suicide to undetermined. However, there would eventually be some resolution in Danny's case. In 2005, a man named Eric Windhurst was charged with murdering Danny. At the time the crime took place, Eric was only 17 years old and had been dating Danny's 15-year-old stepdaughter, Melanie Cooper. During the original investigation, Melanie had provided Eric with an alibi, claiming they were both at a field hockey game that day. When Danny divorced Melanie's mother, she took their children and moved to Alaska, but Melanie was not happy there and decided to return to New Hampshire to live with other relatives. However, after Melanie became involved with Eric, she revealed to him that Danny had physically and sexually abused her during the time he was married to her mother. Now that she had returned to New Hampshire, Melanie was fearful that Danny would come after her again. It's always been up for debate who actually came up with the idea, but these revelations paved the way to Eric firing the fatal shot into Danny's heart with a .270 caliber rifle, and Melanie was present when this took place. By the time Melanie was re-interviewed by investigators years later, she was married with 5 children and had become a devout Mormon, so she wanted to get this dark secret off her chest. When Melanie got Eric to reveal incriminating info during a phone call which was recorded by police, this led to Eric's arrest. He wound up pleading guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 15 to 36 years in prison. Eric is still incarcerated today, while Melanie served 15 months for hindering the investigation, before her release. It was now apparent that Danny's murder had no connection to the death of his mother, but in spite of these many twists and turns, the death of Rena Paquette continues to officially remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So this turned into a very convoluted story containing 4 separate murders, only 2 of which have been solved. Like I mentioned earlier, the Danny Paquette murder received the brunt of the attention when the story was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but since the case is now closed, I won't spend too much time dwelling on it. If you'd like to learn more about Danny's case, there's a fascinating book about it titled Our Little Secret, The True Story of a Teenage Killer and the Silence of a New England Town, written by Kevin Flynn and Rebecca Lavoie. By the sound of things, there were a number of people who knew Eric Windhurst was Danny's killer, but remained silent about it for 2 decades because they believed Danny was a child molester who got what he deserved. Now, the Paquette family has always maintained that Melanie Cooper's allegations about Danny sexually abusing her were not true, and given how many years have passed, we'll probably never know the real truth. If Danny really was sexually and physically abusive towards his stepdaughter, then his actions cannot be excused in any way. But regardless, you still have to sympathize with his tragic ordeal of discovering his mother's burned body as a teenager, as that obviously had a traumatic impact on him. But since we now know that Danny's murder had no direct connection to what happened to his mother, this episode is going to focus on her case, since Rena Paquette never received justice for what happened to her. Now, I've seen my fair share of cases where someone died a very suspicious death, and the authorities made the very questionable decision to rule it a suicide, but I can't think of too many which were as intelligence insulting as this one. We have a woman who was found burned to death, and even though there was no sign of a gas can or any sort of container which could have been used to hold an accelerant, the police come to the conclusion that she somehow committed suicide by setting herself on fire? How exactly would that have been possible? Did they believe Rena was the victim of spontaneous combustion? And how did she manage to place logs in front of the outside of the pigsty's door and seal herself inside? And then they try to claim she did this because she was despondent over the JFK assassination? I'm sure millions of people were left despondent by that event, but this was 2 months after the fact, and I have my doubts it's going to compel someone to walk a half-mile in freezing weather in a nightgown and slippers before setting themselves on fire. To top it all off, Rena's death took place right after she provided information to the police about a murder, and on the very same morning the prime suspect was released from custody after he was questioned. And even after the same suspect was charged with the murder 2 weeks later, they still continued to maintain that Rena committed suicide? The idiocy on display here just blows my mind. So even though her death is still technically listed as undetermined, I'm not even going to entertain the possibility that it was a suicide. But before we delve any deeper into Rena's case, let's talk about the other 2 murders in this story, Sandra Valade and Pamela Mason. We had a conviction in Pamela's case, and Sandra's is still officially unsolved, though many people believe that Edward Coolidge was responsible for both crimes. Now, after learning that Coolidge's conviction for Pamela's murder was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, I started to wonder if perhaps they got the wrong guy. I mean, even though it was overturned on a technicality, most of the evidence against Coolidge was circumstantial, and it was hardly a slam dunk case. Even after Coolidge agreed to enter a guilty plea for a reduced sentence and serve 25 years in prison, he still continued to maintain that he was innocent after he was released. But when you look at the big picture, that's highly doubtful. You have to remember that back in 1964, there was no DNA testing, and forensic science was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, so murder cases often had to be built up on circumstantial evidence. Multiple ballistics experts seem convinced that the bullets used to kill Pamela and Sandra matched Coolidge's Mossberg rifle, though his defense team caused uncertainty by claiming that Coolidge did not even own that gun until after Sandra's murder. However, we only really had Coolidge's word that he received the gun at that time, as there were no records to back up his claim. The most damning evidence which points to Coolidge's guilt are his attempts to get multiple people to fabricate an alibi for him, the holes in his story about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, and the fact that motorists pushed his vehicle out of the snow at a location which was close to the murder scene. And as far as I know, the laundromat owned by Coolidge's mother was the only location where Pamela posted the flyer advertising her babysitting services. When you couple in all this stuff together, I'm pretty confident that Coolidge was guilty of this crime. I mean, really, what does it say when his own mother believed he was responsible and was practically nudging Rena to turn him in to the authorities? Yes, his conviction was overturned in a landmark court case, but that was purely on a technicality because the Manchester police did not follow proper procedure when obtaining evidence against him. And while it's true that innocent people will often plead guilty to crimes they did not commit, Coolidge's decision to plead guilty to second-degree murder still meant he was going to spend another decade or two in prison. I think he probably believed the case against him was still strong enough that he would be found guilty and given another life sentence if he decided to go on trial again. There isn't a whole lot of information out there about Sandra Ballad's murder, but I think it's likely that Coolidge was guilty of that crime as well. In spite of the uncertainty of whether Coolidge owned his Mossberg rifle in 1960, it seems that the same gun was used to shoot Sandra and Pamela. There were just too many similarities between the two crimes to indicate they were both killed by the same person. After Coolidge was convicted of Pamela's murder, and the charge was dropped for Sandra's murder, Attorney General William Maynard made a comment which rubbed me the wrong way. Quote, "Already got him for one, no need to get him for two." End quote. Well, that's kind of a flippant thing to say, because Sandra's family was still seeking closure in that case. Even if Coolidge was already convicted for another murder, wouldn't you want to be certain whether or not he was responsible for another one? It sounds like Maynard expected Coolidge to remain in prison for the rest of his life, so he felt there was no point building another case against him. But that attitude backfired when Coolidge's conviction was overturned, his sentence was reduced, and he was eventually released. If they had been able to convict Coolidge of Sandra's murder, there's a good chance he never would have gotten out. So now we're going to explore the possibility that Coolidge killed Rena Paquette. On the surface, this does seem like the most likely scenario. Rena was the one who submitted Coolidge's name to the authorities as a suspect. She received 2 threatening phone calls after this happened. Coolidge confronted Rena at the laundromat about the whole thing, and of course, she was killed the very same morning Coolidge was released from custody after being questioned by police. But yet, there are some odd things about this story which make me wonder if there's something else to it. When Rena's body was exhumed in 1991, Coolidge's original defense attorney was interviewed, and he stated that it would have been impossible for him to commit the crime. Remember, when he was questioned about the murder, Coolidge confessed to stealing over $300 from his employer, so the police held him in custody overnight before he appeared in Manchester District Court the following morning on his theft charge. This would have been the same morning Rena was killed, and if Coolidge was in court when it happened, then that gives him an airtight alibi. But the problem is that we don't know the exact time Coolidge was in court, or the exact time Rena's death took place, for that matter. The last person to see Rena alive was her husband when he left the house early that morning. Shortly after 10 a.m., Danny woke up and realized his mother hadn't gotten him up in time for his scheduled dental appointment. That's a window of a couple of hours or so when Rena could have been abducted and murdered. And the fact that Rena was still clad in her nightgown and slippers when she was found would seem to imply that she was abducted a short time after her husband left. If Coolidge was in court and not released from police custody before 10 o'clock, then he couldn't be the perpetrator, but unfortunately, that exact information does not seem to be available. But if it wasn't for the uncertainty about the time issue, then there's no reason to believe Coolidge wasn't responsible. Since he directly confronted Rena at the laundromat and apparently made a pair of threatening calls to her house, he obviously had to know that she was the one who gave his name to the police. And after having to spend the night in custody after being questioned, it's easy to imagine Coolidge immediately racing over to the Paquette farm upon his release. He abducts Rena from her home and then takes her to the pigsty to rape and murder her before setting her body on fire. The reason he may have chosen that particular location is because he allegedly killed Pamela Mason there before dumping her body. We also can't forget that when Danny went looking for his mother, he searched the property for over an hour before he arrived at the pigsty. So even though Rena was missing from the house, she may not have actually been dead yet at the time Danny woke up. The other confusing aspect of this story are the visions Danny supposedly had when he went under hypnosis 2 decades later. He claimed he saw his mother arguing with a delivery man in a white uniform on the morning she was killed. Obviously, it would make sense for Coolidge to be this delivery man, but the question is, were Danny's visions actually real, or did he imagine them? Danny's story is that he slept in because his mother never woke him up, and she was already gone by the time he went downstairs, so I don't know why he would be witnessing her in an argument with the delivery man. If Danny actually saw this, you'd think he would have told the police about it, but the implication seems to be that this was some sort of repressed memory he had blocked out of his head for nearly 20 years. I don't know. I'm inclined to believe these visions are nothing more than figments of Danny's imagination, which never actually occurred. If Danny had revealed specific details which no one else knew before, that would be one thing, but right from the outset, the entire family suspected Edward Coolidge killed Rena. So it's not much of a stretch that Danny would have had a vision of Coolidge arguing with his mother on the morning she was killed. The one detail which makes me think these visions aren't legit is the fact that Danny claimed he saw Coolidge wearing a white delivery man uniform. Coolidge had been taken in for questioning on February 2nd, which was a Sunday, and was released from police custody the following morning, but I have my doubts that he would go home and change into his work clothes before he would head over to the Paquette farm to murder Rena. Maybe Danny was creating these visions in his head as some sort of repressed guilt over failing to save his mother because he slept through her abduction from the house. That may have been one of the reasons he went on to live such a troubled life after the event. As crazy as it sounds, when I initially learned that Danny was killed over an alleged history of physical and sexual abuse towards his stepdaughter, I started considering the possibility that perhaps Danny was the one who actually murdered his mother. Maybe his call to his uncle to search the property for her for over an hour was his way of establishing an alibi for himself. But I think that's a major stretch. Even if Danny really was a child molester, as awful as that is, it's still a far cry from raping and murdering your own mother before setting her body on fire. There's really no need to suspect Danny, or anyone else for that matter, when Rena was directly connected to another obvious suspect who was probably responsible for at least 2 other murders in the area and had the motive and opportunity to commit this crime. I guess the most baffling part of this story is, why were the police so reluctant to pin this crime on Edward Coolidge? The Paquette family has always theorized that since Rena's death took place so soon after Pamela Mason's murder, they didn't want to alarm the community and make everyone think a serial killer was on the loose, which is why they were so quick to label it a suicide. And that logic might make sense if the police had no idea who the killer was, but they had a prime suspect at this point. They were gradually building a case against Coolidge and arrested him only 2 weeks after Rena was killed. And they definitely would have known Rena was the one who submitted his name as a suspect, and her death took place the same morning he was released from custody. I really have no idea why they wouldn't have been extra motivated to pin Rena's murder on Coolidge as well. After they charged him with Pamela Mason's murder, they indicted him for the murder of Sandra Valade, which took place 4 years earlier. Yet they stubbornly refused to change the suicide ruling for Rena's death, even though it took place that exact same month? And if that wasn't enough, the police clearly had evidence that another person was present when Rena died, since semen was found on her body, but they deliberately withheld this information from her family, and they never even learned about it until they saw her autopsy report 27 years later. The whole thing just boggles the mind. Another very odd detail is that Danny's uncle, who found Rena's body with him, happened to be an off-duty Manchester police officer, and you'd think the police would go all out at seeking justice if a family member of one of their own was killed. This is the type of thing you'd expect to find if the authorities were attempting to cover up or protect the perpetrator, but that's definitely not the case here, since he was charged with another crime weeks later. This is why I've always wondered if there's something else to this story we don't know about. However, I think it's possible the main reason the police stuck so rigidly to the suicide ruling was because they'd made some sort of colossal mistake. I'm not exactly sure how Coolidge found out that Rena gave his name to the authorities, but I wonder if the police might have inadvertently shared that information with him. and even though Rena had become an important witness against him, she received no police protection, so Coolidge was free to go murder her in the most brutal fashion imaginable after he was released. By the sound of things, the detectives on the force believed it was murder, and were prepared to investigate Rena's death as a homicide, until Attorney General Maynard ordered them not to pursue it. I think Maynard might have concluded that the authorities screwed up, and were somewhat culpable in Rena's death, which is why all evidence of foul play was covered up, and the whole thing was ruled to be a suicide. But in making this decision, the authorities seriously disrespected Rena's memory and her family. Anyway, I have no idea if Edward Coolidge is still alive today, though I know he was alive as late as 2011 after enjoying 20 years of freedom. What's sad is that if the authorities had done a proper investigation into Rena Paquette's murder and were able to pin that crime on Coolidge, he might still be in prison today. By the time Rena's body was exhumed in 1991, Coolidge had already been released, and they theoretically could have built a new case against him, but by that point, there just wasn't enough available evidence to do so. So yes, even though this case is still officially unsolved, I think it's pretty much a given that Coolidge was Rena's killer. This was obviously a horrible tragedy which affected the entire Paquette family, and the whole situation escalated when Danny was murdered 20 years later. Who knows if things might have turned out differently for them if this case had been properly handled back in 1964. Anyway, I know it's been over 50 years, but if by chance you happen to have any information about the unsolved death of Rena Paquette, or the still unsolved murder of Sandra Valade for that matter, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've released our second exclusive bonus episode this month for our donors in Tiers 2 and 3, along with our very first exclusive video webisode for our Tier 3 donors, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank a bunch of new listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this past week, and they are Linda D., Derek W., Carrie Z., Stacy C., Brendan M., Amber S., Micah, Rebecca C., and Demetria S. Thank you so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide my big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes our eerie music score. I will also be appearing at the Canadian Crime Podcast event, a live show being held at the Hideout Bar in Toronto on July 22nd. It will include myself and a number of other Canadian true crime podcasters, including Christy from Canadian True Crime, Jordan from the Nighttime Podcast, and Jack from Dark Topic. And a couple of our American true crime podcasting friends are actually going to be making the trip and will be in attendance as well, including Nina Instead from Already Gone and Charlie from Insight. Tickets are only $10, and you can find a link to our Eventbrite page to purchase them in our episode description. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.